Carl Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Yet for a very small fraction of humanity, becoming who they are feels less like a privilege and more like a burden. Jung called this state differentiated consciousness, a level of awareness so rare that less than 5% of the population ever achieves it. Imagine living with a mind that refuses shallow answers, emotions that vibrate like symphonies, and a perception that cuts through illusions most people cling to. On the surface, it sounds like a gift, but here's the paradox. Jung uncovered those who possess this extraordinary depth often spend their lives believing something is wrong with them. Think about it. From childhood, you may have been told you're too intense, too sensitive, too curious. You might have felt like an outsider in classrooms where surface-level answers were celebrated while your probing questions were dismissed. Society, Jung observed, does not reward psychological depth. Instead, it teaches rare souls to compress themselves to dim their light so others don't feel threatened. And over time, you may start to believe the lie that your complexity is a flaw rather than a signal of advanced consciousness. But what if the opposite is true? What if, as Jung suggested, these rare individuals represent humanity's next stage of evolution? Philosophers like Nietzsche spoke of the Übermensch, the one who rises above conventional morality to create new values. Dostoevsky wrote of characters so consumed by inner conflict that they revealed truths most people never dare to face. And Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, described the loneliness of holding higher standards of thought and virtue in a world that prefers comfort. These thinkers across time echoed Jung's realization: those who seem too much are not broken. They are breakthroughs, pioneers of what it means to be fully human. So let me ask you, have you ever felt like your very way of existing is too big for the world? Have you ever carried the weight of being told to quiet down, to stop feeling so deeply, to stop asking questions that make others uncomfortable? Jung's answer to you is clear: you are not too much. The world is simply too little. And the very traits that society labels as defects may, in truth, be your greatest evolutionary advantages. Jung's insight went far beyond individual psychology. He recognized that certain rare personalities weren't merely different, they were evolutionarily significant. He believed they carried the seeds of what humanity could one day become. These individuals weren't just born with heightened emotions or sharper awareness, they embodied what he called a new architecture of consciousness. In other words, their very being was a glimpse of humanity's future. Think about how human progress has always unfolded. It wasn't the conformists who moved civilization forward. It was the questioners, the visionaries, the so-called troublemakers who refused to accept what everyone else considered normal. The thinkers who challenged unjust systems, the artists who painted worlds no one had seen, the inventors who built what others thought impossible. Rare personalities, Jung argued, represent this same principle. They refuse to adapt to shallow reality because their psychology is wired for depth. Their resistance isn't rebellion for its own sake, it's the psyche's way of pointing toward new possibilities for all of us. Modern evolutionary psychology supports this. Studies on creativity and resilience show that small groups of individuals with non-conforming traits often become the catalysts of adaptation when societies face crisis. During pandemics, wars, or cultural stagnation, it is usually the people who think differently, those seen as too intense, too sensitive, or too radical, who generate the breakthroughs. In that sense, Jung's rare personalities function like scouts on the edge of human potential. They see ahead of the curve. But here's the tragedy: many of these individuals never realize their evolutionary importance. Conditioned by constant rejection, they internalize the belief that their differences are defects. They silence their voices, hide their gifts, and try to play by the rules of a game they were never meant to fit into. Jung warned that when this happens, the entire collective suffers. Humanity loses access to the very qualities it needs to evolve depth vision and unflinching authenticity. So I'll ask you, have you ever wondered if your refusal to settle your restless search for meaning, your discomfort with shallow living, might not be a weakness, but a sign of advancement? What if your very unease with the world is evidence that you are wired to help create a new one? Jung would tell you this: you're not here to blend in. You're here to expand what it means to be human. The first unmistakable sign of psychological rarity is what Jung described as emotional depth that borders on the supernatural. For most people, emotions are like passing weather, sunny one moment, stormy the next, gone before they even notice the change. But for you, emotions don't just come and go, they resonate. Jung called them affect-toned complexes, waves of feeling that move through your psyche like entire symphonies. A single moment can stir layers of meaning that others will never perceive. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly felt the unspoken tension even before a word was said? Have you ever carried the emotional weight of an interaction long after others had already forgotten it? Jung would tell you this isn't instability, it's sophistication. What therapists sometimes label as too sensitive is in fact your access to what Jung called the objective psyche, the deep reservoir of human experience that connects us all. You're not just feeling your own emotions, you're attuned to the undercurrents of the collective. Modern neuroscience is finally catching up to this insight. Studies on mirror neurons show that some people's brains are wired to mirror and process the emotions of others at a heightened level. Dr. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive people reveals that about 20% of the population has a nervous system designed to process sensory and emotional input more deeply. But Jung recognized an even rarer phenomenon: individuals whose entire emotional architecture operates at an advanced level, giving them an almost mystical attunement to the hidden patterns of human life. Of course, this depth comes with challenges. You've probably been told you overreact or that you should let things go. But Jung saw this as a misunderstanding. You don't simply feel, you illuminate. Your emotional intensity is not a flaw, it's a form of intelligence. You can discern truth in silence, sense lies without evidence, and perceive beauty where others see nothing. Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." For you, that principle multiplies. Everything you feel, no matter how small, becomes a pathway to insight. So I'll ask you directly, when you feel deeply, do you shame yourself for it, or do you recognize it as the very signal that you are wired for extraordinary perception? Jung would insist you are not too emotional. You are tuned to the hidden frequencies of human existence. The third sign of psychological rarity is what Jung called conscious independence. He once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For most people, that terror keeps them clinging to roles, approval, and external validation. But for you, independence wasn't a choice, it was a psychological necessity. Somewhere along the way, often through adversity, you realized that building your identity on the opinions of others was like constructing a house on quicksand. So you stopped. You stood up, often alone, and began the lifelong process of creating a self that could not be stolen. Jung named this journey individuation, the movement toward becoming whole. Rare personalities often begin it earlier than others because life forces them into solitude. Maybe you lost trust in someone who was supposed to protect you. Maybe you endured rejection for being different. Or maybe you simply saw through the masks others wore and refused to live in pretense yourself. Whatever the cause, your independence isn't rebellion, it's an achievement. Consider Marcus Aurelius, who, though Emperor of Rome, wrote in his private meditations about standing firm in his own reason and not bending to the chaos of the crowd. Or think of Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camps and emerged with the conviction that meaning can never be taken away by external forces. These are reminders that independence of spirit is not coldness, it's sovereignty. But this kind of independence comes with challenges. You've likely been misunderstood as distant, stubborn, or too self-reliant. Yet what others misinterpret as isolation is for you sanctuary. It's the space where you confront your shadow, the rejected parts of yourself that demand integration. Jung believed this confrontation was essential, for without it, even the strongest independence collapses into loneliness or arrogance. So I ask you, do you see your independence as evidence of your alienation or as proof that you've survived what others could not? Do you recognize that your solitude is not emptiness but a crucible where the authentic self is forged? Jung would tell you this: independence is not the absence of connection. It's the foundation that makes authentic connection possible. The fourth sign of psychological rarity is what Jung described as hyper-perceptive awareness. Most people notice words, gestures, and obvious signals. But you notice what remains unsaid, the flicker of doubt in someone's eyes, the pause, too long, before an answer, the subtle shift in energy that everyone else misses. Jung defined intuition as perception via the unconscious. In other words, it's the ability to draw insights from signals so subtle they bypass conscious thought. For you, this isn't an occasional spark of insight, it's a constant stream. Have you ever sensed that someone was struggling even when they smiled and insisted they were fine? Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt the invisible currents of tension or harmony before anyone spoke? This is not paranoia. It is sensitivity operating at an advanced level. Jung saw this as evidence of what he called active imagination, the unconscious processing of patterns others overlook. Modern psychology echoes this. Research on micro-expressions, those fleeting facial movements that reveal hidden emotions, shows that certain individuals detect them with uncanny accuracy. Dr. Elaine Aron's studies on highly sensitive people explain why some nervous systems are wired to process information at extraordinary depth. You don't just hear words, you register tone, posture, silence, and atmosphere simultaneously. Let me give you a case example. Imagine Anna, a 34-year-old teacher. During staff meetings, she often noticed subtle unease in her colleagues, restless hands, forced laughter, or sudden stillness before anyone admitted to stress. Later, when budget cuts were announced, it became clear she had picked up on signals the entire team had suppressed. For years, she felt crazy for noticing what no one else acknowledged until she realized her perception wasn't madness. It was mastery. But here's the danger Jung warned about without boundaries. This heightened awareness can drain you. You risk becoming an unconscious therapist absorbing pain that doesn't belong to you, regulating conversations to keep others comfortable, carrying emotional weight that leaves you exhausted. The challenge isn't turning off your perception, it's learning discernment. So I'll ask you, do you treat your hyper-awareness as a curse you wish you could mute, or as a skill that needs wise stewardship? Jung would remind you your perception is not weakness, it is vision. But vision without protection becomes a burden instead of a gift. The fifth sign of psychological rarity is an unrelenting craving for meaning above all else. For most people, comfort, recognition, or success is enough. They chase applause, material gain, or social approval. But for you, none of that satisfies unless it carries depth. Jung observed that when someone lives against their true psychological type, the psyche rebels. He called it the birth of neurotic symptoms, emptiness, anxiety, quiet desperation. In rare individuals, this rebellion is powerful. You cannot pretend that shallow goals matter. Your psyche simply won't allow it. Think about it. How many times have you tried to follow the script, study hard, achieve the title, earn the respect only to feel an ache of hollowness after reaching the milestone? How often have you looked at what others call success and thought, is this all there is? This is not ingratitude, it is authenticity. Jung knew that your inner architecture is wired for depth, not surface. Philosopher Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camps, made a similar discovery. He argued that humans can endure almost any suffering if they can find meaning within it. But without meaning, even pleasure becomes unbearable. That's why you've likely outgrown environments where superficiality dominates. That's why shallow relationships leave you restless. That's why achievements without alignment feel like betrayal. And here's something fascinating. Modern research shows that people who prioritize meaning over status often become catalysts for change. They inspire others to question their own compromises. In refusing to accept an inauthentic life, you force those around you to confront their own avoidance of truth. Jung would call this being an evolutionary catalyst. Your hunger for meaning becomes contagious. Of course, this can isolate you. Others may see you as difficult, demanding, or impossible to please, but deep down you know this isn't about perfection, it's about integrity. You would rather endure solitude than live a life that feels false. So let me ask you, when faced with choices, do you compromise for comfort, or do you risk everything for meaning? Jung would remind you, the privilege of a lifetime is not to be accepted by everyone. It is to become who you truly are, even if that path is lonelier, harder, and infinitely more real. The sixth sign of psychological rarity is your repeated experience of outgrowing people and environments. Jung described this process as a cycle of psychological death and rebirth. To evolve, parts of you must die: the roles you once played, the beliefs you once held, the relationships that once defined you. Most people resist this because it's terrifying, but for you it's inevitable. Once you've seen through the veil of conditioning, you cannot unsee it. Once you've tasted authenticity, you cannot go back to pretending. Have you ever noticed how friends from the past no longer recognize you? Not because you've betrayed them, but because you've shed skins they still cling to. They remember the version of you who played small, who pleased others, who silenced questions to keep the peace. And sometimes they ask you implicitly or directly to return to that version because it felt safer. But here's the truth, you can't. Jung said, psychological evolution is irreversible. To regress would be to betray your own soul. Philosophy echoes this reality. Nietzsche described life as a process of becoming, where the self is always in flux, destroying old values to create new ones. Buddhism teaches impermanence, that clinging to what no longer serves is the root of suffering. And in modern psychology, developmental theorists like Robert Kegan confirm that personal growth often means leaving behind earlier selves that no longer fit. But this constant evolution carries grief. You lose not only people but also versions of yourself, and others may judge your growth as arrogance, instability, or coldness. Yet Jung would insist this is not rejection, it is rebirth. Each ending is a gateway to greater authenticity. So let me ask you, how many times have you been told you've changed as if it were an accusation? And did you secretly wonder if that was true? Jung would answer without hesitation, yes, you have changed. And that change is not betrayal, it's evolution in action. If people cannot follow it, is because their journey is not yours. The seventh sign of psychological rarity is what I call transformational presence. Jung once said, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. For most, such transformation happens rarely by accident. For you, it happens constantly, simply by showing up authentically. Have you noticed how people open up around you often more than they intended? How strangers confide secret, or how friends tell you they feel lighter after speaking with you? This is no coincidence. Jung identified this as the ability to create psychological holding space, an atmosphere where others feel safe enough to drop their masks. You don't just listen to words, you listen to the silence beneath them. You don't impose solutions, you witness truth until it rises on its own. But here's the paradox: because your presence is healing others unconsciously, lean on it. They draw from your depth, sometimes without giving back. You become the anchor, the confidant, the healer. Yet too often, no one asks how you are doing. Jung warned of this pattern, and modern psychology confirms it. Highly empathetic individuals frequently develop what's called helper syndrome, an unconscious compulsion to give until they are depleted. Consider this scene. Imagine Daniel, a 42-year-old consultant. Colleagues always turn to him in crises, whether for advice, comfort, or just quiet reassurance. Over time, he noticed he was carrying everyone's burdens, yet rarely voicing his own. He mistook exhaustion for strength until his health began to collapse. Only then did he realize presence without boundaries is self-destruction. Philosophers have long cautioned against this imbalance. Seneca, the Stoic thinker, wrote that no person has the power to have everything they want, but it lies in their power not to want what they do not have. Applied to you, this means learning discernment. Not every problem is yours to solve. Not every wound is yours to carry. So let me ask you, when you notice your presence transforming others, do you see it as a gift you can share selectively, or as a burden you must endlessly carry? Jung's answer is clear: your presence is powerful, but it must be guided by wisdom. Healing is not just about giving, it's about knowing when to hold space and when to preserve your own. The eighth sign of psychological rarity is the persistent sense of a purpose that can't yet be defined. Jung believed this was the psyche's expression of the transcendent function, a restless pull toward individuation, toward becoming the fullest version of yourself. For most people, purpose comes neatly packaged: a career, a role, a family, script to follow. But for you, those boxes feel too small. There's an inner voice whispering, you're meant for something more, even when you can't yet explain what that more is. Have you ever felt a quiet ache? A knowing that refuses to be silenced? You might be living what looks like a normal life, doing the work, meeting obligations, yet still feel incomplete, as if some deeper calling has not yet been named. Jung would tell you, this is not confusion, but evidence of creative potential seeking expression. It's not about fame or recognition, it's about alignment. Your psyche demands harmony with your truest nature, and until you find it, nothing else feels whole. Consider Mei Lin, a 29-year-old architect. On paper, she had success awards, a stable income recognition from her peers. Yet she confessed to feeling hollow, as though her life was a rehearsal for something unnamed. Years later, she shifted her work to designing sustainable housing for marginalized communities. Suddenly the restless ache eased. Her purpose hadn't been missing. It had simply been waiting for her to grow into it. Philosophers and psychologists have echoed this reality. Nietzsche wrote that he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Viktor Frankl demonstrated through his research that purpose is not a luxury, it is a psychological necessity. And Jung himself warned that those who ignore their calling often spiral into depression, anxiety, or a pervasive sense of meaninglessness. So let me ask you, do you dismiss that restless knowing as unrealistic, or do you treat it as a compass pointing you toward your next transformation? Jung would remind you that purpose doesn't always reveal itself at once. Sometimes it begins as a whisper, a discontent, a subtle longing. But that longing is not emptiness, it is evolution calling you forward. Jung recognized that rare personalities do not simply appear fully formed, they evolve through stages. The first stage he called the unconscious outsider. In this phase you feel different, but don't understand why. You carry depth sensitivity and awareness, yet society convinces you these are problems to be fixed. To cope, you build what Jung called persona rigidity, a mask of normalcy designed to protect you from rejection. You try to blend in, but the cost is enormous. Beneath the mask, your true self suffocates. If you're fortunate, you enter the second stage, the awakening individual. Here, you begin to see your traits not as defects but as gifts. You realize that your too much is not weakness, it's evidence of psychological advancement. Jung described this as shadow integration, the process of reclaiming the parts of yourself you were taught to reject. Instead of apologizing for your depth, you begin to own it. Instead of chasing approval, you start to build boundaries. You search for relationships that honor authenticity rather than demand your silence. This is often the stage where life feels both liberating and disruptive, because embracing your truth means losing people who only knew the masked version of you. Finally, if you persist, you reach the third stage, individuated consciousness. At this level, you have integrated your rare traits into a coherent identity. You understand your purpose and live it with intention. You become, in Jung's words, whole. You are no longer defined by the approval or disapproval of others. Instead, your authenticity becomes a beacon, attracting other rare souls and giving permission for them to live fully as themselves. But Jung warned even in these advanced stages, danger lurks in the shadows. The superiority shadow whispers that your rarity makes you better than others, leading to arrogance and isolation. The messianic shadow tempts you to believe it's your job to fix everyone, which ends in burnout and bitterness. The martyrdom shadow convinces you that being rare means you are destined to suffer. Jung insisted that shadow integration never ends, because without it, your gifts can become your prison. So let me ask you, which stage do you recognize yourself in? Are you still hiding behind the mask of the outsider? Are you awakening, claiming your gifts, but wrestling with loss? Or are you stepping into individuation, living as a beacon for others? Jung's message is timeless. Wherever you are, the work continues. Evolution doesn't stop. The rarest gift is not just possessing depth, it's learning how to carry it wisely. Jung's final insight into rare personalities was both liberating and sobering. With rarity comes responsibility. Your traits are not accidents, they are assignments. Jung believed that individuals with advanced psychological architecture serve as bridges between the unconscious and the conscious, carrying insights others cannot yet access. But that bridge comes with weight. People will either be drawn to your light, try to dim it, or meet you as equals. He observed 3 types of relationships: the light seekers, those unconsciously attracted to your depth, but who may consume your energy without reciprocity; the light dimmers, those who feel threatened by your intensity and urge you to tone down, be reasonable, or stop complicating things; and the light matches, the rare individuals who have done their own inner work and can meet you at your level. The task is learning discernment, what Jung called psychological discrimination. Without it, you risk entanglement with people who mistake your gifts for their property. But beyond relationships, Jung emphasized the larger role of rare personalities. You are not simply different for your own sake, you exist to expand what it means to be human. Every time you refuse to settle for surface answers, you stretch the boundaries of collective consciousness. Every time you choose authenticity over acceptance, you show others what's possible. Yes, this path is lonely. Yes, it requires a courage few will ever know. But Jung believed this loneliness is the crucible from which evolution emerges. Still, there's danger. Jung warned against psychological inflation, believing that being rare makes you superior rather than simply responsible. True rarity carries both humility and power. Your sensitivity isn't fragility, it's intelligence. Your intensity isn't too much, it's exactly what transformation requires. Your refusal to settle isn't stubbornness, it's progress in motion. So let me ask you, will you apologize for your depth, or will you carry it consciously, humbly, and with courage? Will you shrink to fit a world that fears your light, or will you embody it fully and become a magnet for those ready to awaken? Jung's words echo here. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. That is your work. To love your rarity even when others don't understand it. To live your authenticity so fully that you become living proof of what humanity can become. If even half of these signs resonate, remember this: you are not too much. The world is too little. And perhaps your greatest responsibility is not to be understood by everyone, but to embody the extraordinary so that others know it is possible.